The Shep Naz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shep Naz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. This past Sunday, we started a new message series called Rhythms of Grace with Pastor Rob. And so today and tomorrow, we're going to be taking a little bit deeper dive into the message from yesterday. If you haven't seen that message yet, you're more than welcome to stop over at shepnaz.org and go to the Shep Now page. You'll see the message archive. And I also see daily helps where you can see the message, and you can also follow along with the 5-day devotional, the leader guide, the parent guide. We have all those resources available for you. But right now, we have the man himself, Pastor Rob, to tell us a little bit more about the message that he gave us yesterday.
Well, great. Thanks for that intro. It's good to be here. And I'm super excited about this series. I think it's has potential to be really helpful to people in their walks with the Lord. And I know it's really helping me. And as we started the series, I kind of began with Mark chapter 1. And we've got the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew is a lot more detailed. Luke is a doctor, and he's got like the human side of everything. John was just very different. But Mark is kind of like summarizing. Like Mark gets like right to the point. He doesn't like tell the flowery story like Matthew or Luke would. He's like gets right to it. And in Mark chapter 1, there's a whole lot of things that happen, including all the way up to Jesus calling his disciples. Mm-hmm. And so in Mark chapter 1, verse 16, Mark says, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew, Simon who eventually becomes Peter, by the way, casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. In verse 17, it says, "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." And verse 18 says, at once they left their nets and followed him. So it's wow. Here's Jesus walking along. He sees two guys, says, "Come follow me." They drop everything that they're doing, and they come and follow Jesus. And while that's exactly right, it's a summary of what happened. There's a whole lot of backstory to that and things that were going on in their lives and everything like that. But the question that I think is that's interesting to me is that what would prompt Simon and Andrew, and then James and John, when he walks on down the road, the sea a little bit, the beach, he sees James and John, and he says the same thing, "Come and follow me." And all four of these men drop their fishing nets, leave their boats, and when James and John left, they left their father, Zebedee, who was there with them. Yeah. So Andrew and Simon, brothers, drop their stuff. James and John drop their stuff, walk away from their dad and the family business, and they start following Jesus. And to me, the question is, I think it's an interesting question, is what in the world would cause these four guys to literally drop their careers, walk away from everything that their livelihood, the thing that paid their bills, took care of their family? What would cause them to walk away from that and follow Jesus when Jesus just walks up and says, "Follow me"?
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to think of that. How many of us would do that as people that know Jesus, as believers, to walk away from our careers at a moment's notice? Yeah. And these people didn't even know him yet.
Right. I mean, I think that they knew about him. Right. But I mean, at this point, Jesus hasn't done the things that we're going to read about in Scripture later, and he has done the miracles and everything. But somehow they knew there was something about him that when this rabbi walked by and says, "Come and follow me," they're like, "Oh, we're in. We're leaving." They dropped it and they went to follow him. And I think part of it is to try to understand the spiritual development culture of Jesus' day. In other words, what was happening in the culture that developed people spiritually? Like today we have the church and Christian universities and those kind of things. What was it that they did to develop their spiritual life back then? And there's two things I wanted to talk about. One is understanding what a rabbi was like, and then the other is understanding what a disciple was like, because this is what this is all about, right? And a rabbi, we don't have rabbis in the Nazarene church. I mean, there are still rabbis in the Jewish tradition, but a rabbi in Jesus's day was really, it was an honorific title given by the Jews to a respected teacher of the law. And so when a person said rabbi, what they were actually calling them was my master. That's what rabbi means, like my master. So anytime you would see someone calling someone a rabbi, they're like, it was a term of like great respect. I'm like, you're my master, you're my teacher, I'm under you. And most rabbis, to become a rabbi back then, you have to train under another rabbi. Like there wasn't an online course you could take that said how to become a rabbi, or rabbis for dummies, or any of that kind of stuff. It was you studied under another rabbi, and when that rabbi said you were ready, then you could go and get your own followers. Interesting thing is that for Jesus, he didn't study necessarily under another rabbi that we're aware of, but the interesting thing is that a rabbi's authority comes from his life and his teaching. Like today, people go to college and they get a degree, and there's a level of authority that comes with the degree. I have a bachelor's degree, or I have a master's degree, or I have a degree where I get a title, right? So a doctor or whatever. So, and those titles give us a level of respect in the culture that we live in. There wasn't a place that said, that certified you as a rabbi back then. People decided if you were a rabbi worth following or not based on your life and your teachings. And it was at about age 30 that most rabbis who had been studying long enough under a rabbi could become a rabbi. And interestingly, Jesus was about 30 when he began calling these his own followers as well. So we see that Jesus had authority in his life in Matthew chapter 7 when Jesus was talking to the crowds and teaching. One of the persons said the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. So they were distinguishing Jesus' teaching from the teaching of the law. So Jesus was a guy who had authority, and people knew him and respected him. And every rabbi had a yoke, and you've heard us talk about yokes before. It was this kind of wooden thing that would connect two animals together, so they would pull together in the same direction and not pull a piece of farm machinery apart or whatever if they went different directions. But a yoke also, when it was referring to a rabbi, was his style of teaching. So Jesus said at one point, he says, come to me all who are tired from carrying heavy loads, and I'll give you rest. Place my yoke over your shoulders and learn, because I'm gentle and humble. So Jesus had an easy yoke. And what that meant is that when Jesus was teaching his disciples, he wasn't laying upon them burdens like maybe the teachers of the law would say, you got to do this and you got to do that. And Jesus was like, no, it's not that hard. It's not that difficult. It's not about all these things that they're making it about. So Jesus had an easy yoke. And so with a rabbi back in that day, a rabbi was just seen as like an elite teacher and a magnetic example of life with God. Like they would look at him and say like, oh, that's my goal. I want to be like that person. I want to have a relationship with God like that. They were like celebrities, or today are social media influencers, or a rock star or something. I don't know. They were just, people wanted to emulate them. And that's what Jesus was.
Every year on Thanksgiving, we're reminded that gratitude is a decision that we get to make. There are many things that are out of our control. The children won't stop getting older. The headlines keep getting crazier. The Christmas advertisements keep starting earlier and earlier every single year. The world around us is always changing, and there's a lot that we don't get to decide. But gratitude is a decision that we get to make. So let's decide to keep opening our doors. Let's decide to set the table and join hands. Let's decide that no matter what may come, our words to Jesus will always be, thank you.
Call in your Thanksgiving praise at 614-475-3964 and hear your message on Thanksgiving Day on the Shepnaz Podcast. Well, and going back to the yoke for a moment, I think it was great insight there that you pulled out, and I just kind of want to circle back to it, is that I think a lot of times in Christian tradition, when we've heard the phrase, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, it's confusing to understand that, because it seems like, well, if you're referring to the Christian life, it doesn't really seem that easy and doesn't seem that light. But what you're pointing out is that it's his approach. It's the way he will work with you. It's the way he's going to teach you, that he's not going to be overburdensome. He's not going to be difficult. He's going to work with you. And I think that's a really great insight that you pointed out there, that it's not necessarily referring to our Christian walk like, oh, the Christian walk is easy.
Right.
He's saying the way that I come
Yeah.
at you is
Yeah.
going to be easy and gentle.
Well, while you're saying that, what I'm thinking about is a lot of the Pharisees and scribes who would have been rabbis and had their own followers and people following them around would have been talking about the laws. And there were lots of laws, like hundreds of them. I need to look back up to remember again, but literally hundreds of them. And they would wear them on a box, they'd roll them up in a scroll, and there was hundreds of laws. Jesus said, here's an example of Jesus making his yoke easy. Jesus said, it's really only two things you need to do. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Like he took all the laws and he said, let's just summarize them into two.
Right.
You don't have to learn 700 laws. Just do these two laws. I mean, that's an example of Jesus saying, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Like I'm not going to put you down. But the thing is that if you love God with all your heart and you love your neighbor as yourself, all those other laws,
you're going to do all those.
They
other
fall
things.
into place.
Yeah.
But there's just the wrong focus or whatever. And so Jesus was this magnetic, right, rabbi. And when he walks by to Peter and Simon, or Simon and Andrew and James and John, it wasn't like, it's like, who is this guy? It's like they knew who he was, right? But then the other thing is about disciples. And so I found this really fascinating as I was learning this. There's different levels of discipleship when Jesus was walking on the earth in the first century. And most Jewish kids, there's level 1, level 2, level 3. That's how I'll describe it. Level 1 was that kids would go to the house of the book, which was the Hebrew word was Bet Sefer. And so they would go to this house of the book, and it was similar to like an elementary school. The Bet Sefer or Beth Sefer was usually attached to a synagogue. It was run by another rabbi or a scribe or a teacher or something like that. And this was a focus on the Torah. Now, this is fascinating. I think this makes us in the 21st century look like slackers, right? and by the age of 12 to 13, a kid who was going to Beth Sefer would have memorized the entire Torah. That's what they did at their school. So they memorized the entire Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you've read some of those books, like Numbers, it is not riveting. But these guys had memorized it.
I wouldn't have wanted to go to numbers class.
No. Like that's the day you want to be on, out, go to Disney World that day, or fake that you're sick. But think of that. So the expectation for kids that were Jewish kids back then was that by the age of 12 or 13, they had memorized not a few verses or even that it's just the 5 books. They memorized the books. Mm-hmm. Like Genesis has 50 chapters in it. And then they go into Exodus and the whole story. So they knew these kinds of things. And so after that, there was the second level of school called Beth Midrash. And this was a Hebrew term that stood for the house of learning. And the house of learning was really only for the best of the best and the brightest students, right? And so by the age of 17, so you get another 4 or 5 years here, you would have memorized the entire Old Testament.
Wow.
That blows me away.
That is amazing.
I would fail out of there miserably. I mean, how many people listening today can say, what are the 66 books in the Bible? Just name them.
Right. Could you even list them?
Let's just say, how about what are the 39 books of the Old Testament? Just name them right now in order. These kids, by the age of 17, did not only do that, they memorized them. And they were like, this is how they became so good at knowing what the law was and everything. And so there's this. So by the time that they had memorized the Torah, then they'd memorized the rest of the Old Testament. Most of them for their life, their education was done, right? They're done. But there was another level of learning, another level that existed, and this was only for the best of the best of the best. Like, I'm talking about people who had memorized the entire Old Testament. Just, that's impressive enough, right?
Sure.
But now the best of those guys would apply to be an apprentice under a rabbi. So they would go on to the next level, and the next level was an apprentice. Now, most people would stop there. They would be relegated to going and finding a job and making babies and having families, and that's their life now. But if you were like the best of the best, you would want to apprentice under a rabbi. And it was very difficult because there wasn't very many that were smart enough to do this, or even, had the intentionality to want to do that. And a rabbi was going to be very, very choosy, right?
Sure.
About who he picks, because the quality of the student represented the quality of the rabbi. So they're picking only the very best, right? These people would be interviewed. They would be on issues of history, their beliefs, who they would side with on this issue or on that issue, who they would agree with on controversial issues. They would check your family pedigree. They would find out what your work ethic was like. They would discover if you were emotionally healthy enough to follow them. They only wanted the best of the best, and only the best of the best were chosen. And if you had passed the test, and very few ever did, then the rabbi might say something like this to you: "Come and follow me."
Wow.
It's the same words that Jesus said to Simon and Andrew and James and John. And it's like, wow. I mean, when Jesus said that to those guys, they knew it was an opportunity of a lifetime. They were fishermen. They had not been picked by a rabbi. They had already started their career and their families. And when Jesus comes by and says, "Come and follow me," they're like, "Oh, I'm out of here." They drop their nets and like, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. One of the resources I was looking at said that to be a disciple in that day under a rabbi was equivalent to the best education that money could buy. And he used the example of Ivy League, which may be in question a little bit nowadays, right. But still, like, it was more exclusive than that. Like, it wasn't even accessible to so many people. And then to be a disciple would have three goals, right? And the three goals of being a disciple would be, number one, to be with your rabbi. Like, that's goal, to be covered in his dust, to follow him everywhere he went, to hear everything that he said, to do everything that he did, and you would just be with him. And Mark kind of tells that story. In Mark chapter 3, Mark says that Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to those whom he wanted, and they came to him, and he appointed 12, designating them apostles. And then he says, so that they might be with him.
Wow.
Like, the reason that Jesus called them was so that they could live with him and watch and hear and see and listen to everything that he said and did. So it was this incredible privilege to be with him. But listen, to be with the rabbi wasn't like signing up for night classes. And it wasn't like signing up for school where you go to school of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 1 o'clock to 2:30. It was like 24/7. You leave everything and you follow him, and you're with him all the time. And so it's to be with him. And then the second goal of having a rabbi is that you would become like your rabbi. Like, you wouldn't follow a rabbi you didn't want to become like. And so a disciple would like, I want to be like this guy. And they want to be like him in every way. They would copy the tone of his voice, his teaching style, his mannerisms, his figures of speech. They wanted to be just like their rabbi. And in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, Jesus even says these words: students, which the Greek word that he uses is mateos, which means disciples, are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will be like the teacher. And so here's like the goal of being a disciple and following your rabbi is that you be like him. Right? So it's to be with him, to be like him. And then the last thing is to do what they would do, like to do the things that he would do. and so the ultimate goal of a disciple was for one day for your rabbi to say, "You're ready. Now go." Here's another one: go and make disciples.
Yeah.
And these are words that Jesus said to us, these common words that Jesus said to us. And so just being able to understand that I think is really interesting. And here's the thing that's interesting to me. When Jesus said to Simon and Andrew, James and John, "Come and follow me," and he calls people today and he says to you and to me and to whoever's listening and other people, "Come and follow me," what it meant then is what it still means now.
Right.
But somehow in the church, we have lost what it means to follow Jesus. When Jesus called people to himself, it was this call to reorganize their life, to realign their life, to leave everything to follow him and become like him and do what he did, to be with him, to become like him, and to do what he did. Today, to be a disciple means something totally different. And that's what we'll talk about tomorrow, and how that has changed, and how I think it has really hurt us as believers in the Lord.
Well, that's a great spot for us to stop for today, and we'll dive back into tomorrow. As you're reflecting on this message today, maybe you feel like you've been looked over in the same way that these early disciples had, and not realizing that you're going to have the opportunity to be called by the most ultimate rabbi. And that call comes today.
Yeah. Hey, really fast. I know our music is going to end, but there's in the Count of Monte Cristo, there's a scene in the movie between a priest and a guy who doesn't believe in God. And the priest, something happened to him and he's going to die, and he's giving him this map to where the treasure is. And he says something about God. He's like, God's going to be with you. And the guy says to him, I don't believe in God. And the priest's last words were, it doesn't matter, he believes in you.
Amen.
And like that's what this call is about.
Well, for Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.